This is a 16mm f1.8 full-frame lens, and it might just be the best vlogging lens that you can buy for the Sony ZV-E1.
And I'd like to thank the Per Gear company for sending this lens out for the purpose of making this video, but this is not a paid or sponsored video, and all the opinions are my own.
I think most people, when they're thinking about vlogging lenses, are going to be thinking about zoom lenses, maybe the Sony 16 to 35mm or the Tamron 17 to 28mm, but I will circle back to this at the end of the video and tell you why I think this lens for a lot of people is a better option. To start with, even though it's a 16mm lens, as soon as we activate the active stabilization, you get an extra 10% crop. So now we're down to an 18mm lens. This takes kind of a little bit of that crazy wide or ultra wide or too wide aspect out of it. So for me, starting at that 16mm makes that active stabilization just so much more useful. And this is also going to come in handy if you're sort of in the historic cities or New York cities, you're going through historic churches or buildings, any time where you've got that wraparound environment and you want to show a person or a subject and you want to show them in the context of what's around them. To be able to use that active stabilization mode and still be at 18mm, which is quite wide, is super, super useful. The other thing that this really wide field of view lends itself to is either the cinematic vlog mode in the ZV-E1 or just adding the black bars in editing afterwards to get that cinematic vlog look. And that's because having an ultra wide lens leaves you that extra real estate top and bottom to crop in, but you still get that crazy huge wraparound image because you've got such a wide field of view. So I think that cinematic vlog setup works really well with these ultra wide angle lenses, and it almost gives you this really fake anamorphic Hollywood movie style look. And although we've started at 18mm once we account for that crop factor of the active stabilization, we actually have the clear image zoom that will take us up to an equivalent of around 26mm. And I don't know what the math on this is supposed to be, but I've actually taken this lens and I've tested it side by side with my Tamron 20 to 40mm and identified that if you take the active stabilization and turn it on, you're around that 18mm mark. And if you zoom all the way in with the clear image zoom, you're at around the 26mm mark. So you've got everything going from 18 to 26mm. And as we look at that, I think as we go through that range, 18 is great for that ultra wide that we were just talking about. We get to 20, that's kind of my sweet spot favorite perfect focal length. I think it's sort of the Goldilocks focal length. It's not too wide, it's not too narrow. Then when we go into 24mm field of view, now we're getting what is probably the most popular wide focal length. It's kind of a standard wide focal length, probably the most popular one for using and shooting YouTube videos. So using clear image zoom, you could definitely use it for YouTube videos. And then we go all the way up to 26mm. And 28mm is very, very popular for things like street photography and documentary video, documentary photo. So at 26, we're just shy of almost that perfect focal length for that. So we've got a huge range of versatile focal lengths all falling into that sort of wide angle, which really, really suit this sort of documentary style vlog, photo, and video. And if all that wasn't enough, this is probably the killer feature that you get when using this lens with the ZV-E1. And that's when you turn on dynamic active stabilization. We all know you get this humongous crop. On this lens, it takes you to about a 26mm equivalent. So now we've got a 26mm lens, which is still wide and super, super useful and versatile. If we start at 20mm, like with the Sony 20mm f1.8, we're cropped way in. We're much tighter. But at 26mm, I think this is still a very, very useful wide angle lens with that dynamic stabilization. This is just wide enough to vlog with if you want to hold the camera out at arm's length. It's not the perfect vlogging length, but it's just wide enough to do that. But in addition to that, it's excellent for walk around tracking shots, when you're following other people, when you've got a whole bunch of stuff where you are moving a lot and that video footage is just going to be useless otherwise. By putting that dynamic active on, you're getting that GoPro, crazy GoPro level of digital image stabilization, but you're still at a super useful focal length, which is 26mm. And not only are you getting all this, you are effectively having a lens or a setup which is great in low light and eliminates the need for a gimbal in a large amount of situations. And using this lens with this camera and the way that I've been using it, I really didn't feel the need to pull the gimbal out of my bag. which is huge when you're traveling. So now we've got a really useful focal length. We can isolate our subject, we can let a lot of light in, and we've eliminated the need to set up and use a gimbal. The two other places that this is going to be really handy, having this super wide lens, is one in the auto framing feature that allows you to move around and kind of simulates a cameraman following you around in the frame. By starting at 16 millimeters, we have this huge wide field of view. We've got 3 different levels of crop that we can enable, and this creates 3 totally different looks as far as how that footage looks. Starting at that really wide 16 millimeters just makes this so much more versatile and so much more useful. The other thing that's going to take advantage of this really wide lens is the framing stabilization. That's where you click on a person in the frame, you enable this, and it tries to keep them in that part of the frame, whether 1/3 or in the middle of the frame. Once again, having this huge wide focal length, having this huge field of view is once again making that function so much more useful. So when I was first looking at the Viltrox 16mm f1.8, all I could think was 16 millimeters is just going to be too wide for this sort of vlogging style content. It's going to be an astro lens, it's going to be a landscape lens, it's going to be an architecture lens. But the reality of it is, when you're using it for video and vlogging, you're actually going to turn on that active stabilization. You're starting at around 18 millimeters, and with the clear image zoom or the dynamic active stabilization, you're going up to 26 millimeters. So what you're getting out of this lens with the Sony ZV-E1 is you're essentially getting an 18 to 26 zoom lens with a maximum aperture of f1.8. In addition to that, at 26 millimeters, you're getting a 26 millimeter lens with dynamic active stabilization, which replaces the need to use a gimbal. Now, one of the lenses you might compare the Viltrox 16mm f1.8 to is the Sony 16 to 35 f2.8, because that is a very popular vlogging lens. To start with, that Sony lens is a $2,000 lens. The Viltrox we're looking at is a $550 lens. The Sony lens is bigger and heavier, it's worse in low light, and although I don't have it to compare side by side to the Viltrox, I actually think the image quality will be worse out of the zoom lens. That's pretty typical of good quality prime lens will almost always outperform a zoom lens, and certainly that Sony is no slouch, the image quality is very good, but I think side by side, if you compare them, the Viltrox will outperform as far as complete sharpness and total detail and resolution. Obviously, the big advantage of the Sony lens is it is a zoom lens, which is quite a significant advantage, but you're also giving up significant low light performance because there's a big difference between f1.8 and f2.8. Other one you might compare it to is the Tamron 17 to 28mm f2.8. Once again, the zoom lens is going to have the advantage of the zoom range. It's also going to be a little bit lighter than the Viltrox lens. It's about $350 more, and the Viltrox lens should have better image quality overall, and it's also going to be better in low light against, same as it was compared to the Sony lens. So in both of these comparisons, although you are giving up the versatility of that zoom range because of the smart functions of the Sony ZV-E1, you are still getting kind of an equivalent zoom range of 18 to 26 millimeters when you're using the different stabilization modes and the clear image zoom, and you're getting better low light performance, you're getting a cheaper lens, and compared to the Sony lens, you're getting a lighter lens as well. The other thing that the Viltrox lens is going to do for you that both the Sony and the Tamron aren't is with that f1.8 maximum aperture, you're going to be able to isolate your subject and blur out your background and get some separation there, which is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to do with those zoom lenses, particularly at their wider ends. Now, this is a new release lens, so it is not available everywhere. I will put some links in the description down below to the best prices I could find and who currently has it in stock. This is not a lens that I initially thought that I would recommend as a vlogging lens, but after using it in real-world use with the Sony ZV-E1 and all these different features that require or use cropping modes, I think it actually might be the most useful vlogging lens that you can buy for this camera.